Well, I'd like to say welcome to you all to this seminar being presented by the Melbourne Social Equity Institute today. I want to let you know that this event is being live captioned. I haven't used captions myself before, but for those of us who know about it, you probably already know that to click the CC captions box at the bottom of your screen if you'd like to follow along on captions as well. And by way of launching into our session this afternoon, I'd like to acknowledge, first of all, the elders, both past and present and emerging, of the Wurundjeri people who are the custodians of the land that I'm on today. I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which you are, and our university campuses are also situated. These lands being a place of age-old ceremony, of celebration, initiation and renewal, and that the local Aboriginal people have had and continue to have a unique role in the life of all these lands. I'd also like to introduce myself. I'm Bridget Hamilton, Associate Professor and Director of the Centre for Mental Health Nursing in the School of Health Sciences in the Faculty of Medicine, Dentistry and Health Sciences. And I'm also the co-lead of the Mental Health and Society program within the Melbourne Social Equity Institute, alongside Helen and Stokes from Education. The Mental Health and Society program is one of the Institute's emerging themes, and this is a first in a new series of monthly events related to the program. So we really hope that you'll subscribe to the Institute's email list if you haven't done that already. Just practically speaking, you've realised this is a webinar event today, and it is being recorded and will be shared on the Institute's website after the event. Today we are going to use the Q&A function rather than the chat function, so please post any questions that you have for the speakers into the Q&A box, and that'll be moderated in the course of the session. The chat function is operating, and that's particularly, you can say hello to people that you know and chat amongst yourselves, but also let us know if you've got any technical problems. I think that's probably all for housekeeping. So without any further ado, I'd like to introduce Bernadette. She probably doesn't need introduction for a lot of the people here, but I'm sure many of us are honoured to be colleagues of Bernadette's. She is the Foundation Director of the Melbourne Social Equity Institute, a Professor of Law at the University of Melbourne. She served as a legal member of the Victorian Mental Health Tribunal for 16 years. And from March 2019 to just now, this last month, she's been a commissioner with the Royal Commission into Victoria's mental health system. So it's an enormous load that Bernadette has just handed over in the special parliamentary event on Tuesday. So she's resting up, but not that much, as you can see, because she's coming to share with us today. So she's currently a commissioner with the Victorian Law Reform Commission as well. And I'll just hand over to you, Bernadette. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Bridget. I'm speaking to you today from the lands of the Bunurong people, and I also pay respect to elders past, present and emerging. We'll just wait for the PowerPoints to come up. Yes, great. I'm talking today about the brain, the most complex organ in the human body, both in structure and function. Now, as you may be aware, neuroscience is a broad term that is used to describe the study of the brain and the nervous system. There's substantial amounts of data continuing to be collected by neuroscientists to help understand what brains do, but there's so much that we don't know. And at the same time, there are new devices and technology being developed to describe, stimulate, manipulate brain activity. In the United States, there's a brain initiative, the European Union's Human Brain Project, the Australian Brain Alliance. They're all putting in a lot of money into research that deals with the brain and neural functioning. Now, I'm going to move on to the next slide, but before we do, I just want to warn people it might be a little confronting because it shows a rat with a microchip inserted in its head. So if you're feeling a bit queasy and you don't want to see this, I'll tell you when we move on. So we'll go to the next slide now, if we can. And as we're doing that, there we go. Thanks, Kathleen. what really inspired me, I think, to look at this particular topic was Elon Musk, who in November 2019 had a large media event where he reported that his company Neuralink was developing brain-computer interfaces. And he showed this a rat with a device implanted in its head. And he said, we are on the verge of solving a lot of, quote, brain-related diseases. And he mentioned autism, schizophrenia, and memory loss. Now, putting the notion of brain diseases to one side, these are very bold claims. And in 2019, he released a white paper reporting that Neuralink has developed an implantable device which has flexible electrode threads, and they're experimenting with inserting those threads into a rat at the rate of 6 threads per minute. In August 2020, he then reportedly showed a pig that had an implant in its skull, and just this February, he claimed a monkey wired up with a device could play what else but computer games via its thought processes using this device. So we could take issue with this notion that autism, schizophrenia, memory loss are brain-related diseases, but the idea that many mental disorders, for want of a better word, are in fact, in the words of Thomas Insel, biological disorders involving brain circuits is really driving some of this neuroscientific endeavours. And that's what I want to concentrate on today, in particular looking at neurointerventions which are said to help solve, in particular, mental impairments. And by mental impairments, I'm using there the language of the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. I also want to consider some of the ethical and legal issues that we really need to consider whenever we're looking at new technology in general, but I think in particular looking at neurointerventions and what they might mean for personhood. So if we can go to the next slide, what are we actually talking about? Well, first up, this idea of brain-computer interfaces. This involves direct connections between the brain and a computer, with bi-directional feedback between the user and the computer, which in turn produces physical changes in the brain that can often restore a degree of motion control. So that the whole rationale for brain-computer interfaces at present is focusing on enabling people with extensive paralysis or brain injury to control a limited range of motor functions. And I wanted to point to this Stentrode, which has been developed here at Melbourne University. It can be inserted into a vein just under the skull, and it transmits brain signals to a computer, which then translates them into on-screen command. It's really amazing what people are working on at the moment, and you'll see there on the slide it's mentioned that 2 men with motor neurone disease have been able to use their thoughts to control digital devices just simply via this Stentrode device. So the next slide, another form of neurointervention is transcranial magnetic stimulation. This is not invasive. It involves creating a powerful electrical current via an electromagnetic coil resting on the scalp. The current creates a strong but brief magnetic field, and it can pass through the skull and soft tissue, and the current can be pulsed in a way that stimulates neural activity. And similarly, transcranial direct current stimulation involves running a low-level electric current through regions of the brain by placing pairs of electrodes on the scalp to change neural activity in the brain region underneath. So in the early 1900s, there were two psychiatrists, Adrian Polishek and Berthold Beer, who patented an electromagnetic device as a treatment for depression. But it actually wasn't until the mid-1980s that experimentation with TMS became a focus for clinical research. And in 1995, an American psychiatrist, Mark George, and colleagues began experimenting with repetitive TMS as a treatment for depression. And then after several studies, the United States Food and Drug Administration agency approved its use for the treatment of depression. But the jury's still out as to how effective it is and how it actually works. So if we go on to the next slide, the other form of neurointervention that I want to just outline briefly today is deep brain stimulation. And this is where the use of intracerebral electrodes can stimulate the brain. And it can be used to either probe or modulate activity in neural circuits. So the electrodes are implanted either unilaterally or bilaterally deep inside the brain, and electrical currents are delivered from a pulse generator implanted either in the abdomen or under the collarbone. It was first approved in the 1990s as a treatment primarily for tremors associated with Parkinson's disease, but more recently it's been used to alleviate symptoms of severe depression and obsessive-compulsive disorder. Now, it is invasive, so there are more risks associated with it than transcranial magnetic stimulation. On the other hand, it has fewer risks than ablative neurosurgery, which is irreversible. The stimulator for deep brain stimulation can always be turned off, and the implanted electrodes can be removed. Now, just a warning about the next slide. It does show a hole in the skull. So if you're, again, a bit queasy of looking at these sorts of images, I'll tell you when we move on. Now, in terms of history, the search for explanations of brain function, including in relation to consciousness, is nothing new. So neuroscience might be the modern term used, but scientists, experimenters have been trying to work out how the brain works and how to modify neural circuits for centuries. So in terms of brain surgery, for example, there's some evidence that trephining, whereby a hole is surgically made into a skull, occurred in prehistoric times. And the anatomist Paul Broca, for example, looked at a skull in the 19th century that had a hole in its head and apparently was performed in the Cusco district of Peru many centuries before. Now, why this occurred is subject to debate. One rationale that's been suggested was to relieve the symptoms of perceived mental impairments. And in fact, there is apparently a 12th century manuscript which was written by Frigadi of Palermo, which refers to a skull being perforated to allow matter to escape as a remedy for mania and melancholy. Today, neurosurgery to treat brain injuries such as skull fractures or to treat headaches, epilepsy, or neurological disorders, it's become an accepted part of medical practice. Psychosurgery, on the other hand, has been fraught with controversy. So back in 1891, Gottlieb Burckhardt published an account of experiments with cortical extirpation, and this involved severing connections between certain brain areas. And then in 1935, the Portuguese neurologist Egas Moniz wrote about technique which she termed a prefrontal leucotomy as a method of treating severe mental impairments. And that involved destroying connections between the prefrontal region and the limbic system. Then in the 1940s, Walter Freeman and James Watts subsequently developed a standardized method which became known as a lobotomy. There's a wonderful paper by James Caruso and Jason Sheehan, which detail the subsequent falling out between Freeman and Watts about surgical techniques. And they also outline how some patients were very badly damaged after these sorts of lobotomies. And there were, of course, social factors associated with the decline of psychosurgery. On the other hand, at the same time, we have experiments with convulsive treatment. So during the 1930s, an Italian neurologist, Ugo Treletti, and his assistant Lucio Bini experimented with inducing seizures in animals. And they administered electrical stimulus via electrodes to parts of the head. And then in 1938, they used electroconvulsive treatment for the first time on a person experiencing delusions. And since then, there have been various experiments, and electroconvulsive treatment is now used today for people diagnosed with severe depression. Again, a fraught history. Early practice involved administration without muscle relaxants and anaesthesia, and that led to instances of severe physical injuries. There are concerns about memory loss associated with ECT, and how it works is yet to be determined. If we go to the next slide, I want now to turn to some of the ethical issues. Ethics can be defined in different ways. Generally, the term is used to refer to an internal assessment of how to behave in the face of conflicting choices. You can have codes of ethics consisting of rules defined by a certain body or professional organisation. But any technique associated with controlling behaviour obviously requires careful ethical scrutiny. One way of perhaps lessening the concerns about past controversies and adverse consequences concerning neurointerventions such as psychosurgery and ECT is, I think, to ensure that individuals consent to their application. And here, I think international human rights law serves a role. So in particular, the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, which includes people with mental impairments, it sets out that under Article 15, no one shall be subjected without his or her free consent to medical or scientific experimentation. We also have Article 25B, which requires health professionals to provide care of the same quality to persons with disabilities as to others, including on the basis of free and informed consent. However, there's still a presumption persisting that individuals with certain mental impairments can't make decisions for themselves because of a lack of insight. And this is a very general term, but it refers to a person's self-awareness that there's a problem or an illness and an understanding of its cause or meaning. So in the past, particularly with ECT and psychosurgery, it's been assumed that experimentation can go ahead on the basis of the person's best interests, that informed consent is not necessary. There are, I think, today a lot of criticisms of that approach, and I wanted to point to the Committee on the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, which has addressed the issue of informed consent. And I just wanted to read to you a passage that they came up with. They've said, "The right to enjoyment of the highest attainable standard of health includes the right to healthcare on the basis of free and informed consent. States parties have an obligation to require all health and medical professionals, including psychiatric professionals, to obtain the free and informed consent of persons with disabilities prior to any treatment. And I think because of the potential adverse consequences of neurointerventions, it seems preferable to follow that approach and to ensure a focus on full and informed consent for any neurointervention. Moving to another significant ethical issue is that of autonomy. So interfering with the brain raises complex questions about autonomous and responsible agency. Any intervention in the structural functioning of the brain can affect mental processes, and some of which may affect a person's sense of self. There's a New Zealand ethicist, Walter Glannon, who has written a lot on autonomy in relation to neurointerventions. He talks about autonomous agency being synonymous with the self-regulating process and being in control of one's behaviour. So he argues that neurointerventions such as deep brain stimulation can be viewed as supporting a person's ability to be in control of their own behaviour by modulating activity in neural circuits. So on this basis, he sees neurointerventions as enhancing or restoring autonomy. It could be argued here, I think, that if the person were able to switch the stimulus on or off and control the frequency of the stimulator to regulate mood, for example, that would definitely enhance or maybe restore autonomy. So in some ways, the ethical issues here echo those relating to, for example, pharmacological interventions. Is the person's sense of self the same with or without drug treatment? And Bridget Hamilton drew my attention to this wonderful article that she and her colleagues have written, which is called Identity Challenges and Burden of Normality After Deep Brain Stimulation for Severe Obsessive-Compulsive Disorder. It's a narrative case study. It's really interesting, but it also looks at the concept of identity, which is closely allied to autonomy, and what that means for a person whose behaviour is modified by deep brain stimulation. She might want to talk a bit more about that in Q&A. So moving on to legal issues. Ethical issues, I think, can in some way be alleviated through legislation. And given the history of psychosurgery in particular, there's already legislation in operation in certain jurisdictions to either ban or regulate the use of neurosurgery. However, regulation is inconsistent. So, for example, in Australia, regulation occurs on a state or territory basis. If you look to psychosurgery or neurosurgery in relation to people with mental impairment, in the Northern Territory, for example, it's completely banned. A person must not perform psychosurgery on another person. And psychosurgery is defined to include the use of intracerebral electrodes to stimulate a person's brain. Queensland has a similar provision where the penalty is up to 2 years in prison. Compare that to South Australia, where under its Mental Health Act, a psychiatric treatment panel can authorise neurosurgery even where the person has not consented. Whereas in Victoria, under the current law, which is on this slide, the Mental Health Tribunal can authorise neurosurgery, but only where the person has given informed consent in writing. So where legislation exists, it's inconsistent. we go to the next slide, there are, of course, other forms of regulation, such as guidelines, codes of ethics, as well as legislation. In relation to guidelines, there is, for example, in relation to transcranial magnetic stimulation, a group of authorities met in 1996 and agreed on safety and ethical guidelines for both clinical and laboratory settings. And these were updated at a consensus conference in 2008. However, complying with guidelines, policies, codes of practices and the like is usually voluntary, and it's dependent upon agreement between practitioners. So in some ways, legislation can be a stronger force for compliance because it can provide oversight and penalties for not complying. So I think it's probably unrealistic to say we can have a completely consistent approach across jurisdictions, but perhaps where there is regulation, at least some oversight by an independent body seems appropriate. And legislative provisions can also allow for full and informed consent provisions and penalties for breaching informed consent. The limitation, of course, is that legislation, for example, in relation to deep brain stimulation, only relates to public hospitals. And many experimental neurointerventions are being developed by private companies, such as Neuralink. And that poses a dilemma for lawmakers. Consumer laws are obviously relevant to regulating the sale and use of technological devices, but the lack of independent oversight of experimentation does raise concerns about potential harms, even of non-invasive techniques. And there's an article by Adrian Carter, Jamie Walvish of the Melbourne Law School, and Patrick Haylock, which points out that commercial versions of transcranial direct current stimulation devices are not without risk, and they may cause itching, burns, headaches, and impaired mood, memory, and cognition. So given the history of neurointerventions, it's unlikely that experimentation can be completely banned, but it does seem appropriate to talk about possible checks and balances to mitigate any harms. So in terms of the focus on neurointerventions, even if ethical and legal issues are addressed, there remains, I think, a very important point that Stephen Morse has raised, that neuroscience has many things to say, but not nearly as much as people would hope. The psychiatrist Kenneth Kendler has argued that the search for big, simple explanations in psychiatry has been doomed to failure. And the World Health Organization's Mental Health Action Plan acknowledges that we have to move beyond just a biological model in relation to mental impairments. And that plan talks about the need to take social determinants into account. And that should be one of the key objectives in responding to mental impairments. Socioeconomic disadvantage, for example, has been classified as a key risk factor associated with experiencing, and in the World Health Organization's terminology, mental disorders. If we go to the next slide, there's also some indication that public acceptance of neurobiological explanations of mental impairments may increase perceptions that people diagnosed with mental impairments are abnormal or dangerous. That in turn can increase discrimination. So Sven Spearfork and colleagues found that beliefs about brain disease were related to desires for social distancing from those diagnosed with severe depression or schizophrenia. This emphasis that mental impairments are caused by something wrong in the brain may also undermine people's belief in their ability to recover. And there's some research by Caval and colleagues that biogenetic explanations for mental impairments may induce what they call prognostic pessimism. There's also concern about self-stigma, whereby a person internalises stigmatising beliefs about mental impairments, and that may be associated with not wanting to seek help. So there are, therefore, I think, serious consequences associated with studying the brain simply as a biological machine in relation to mental impairments in isolation from social factors. So this, I think, adds impetus to ensuring that neurointerventions are carefully regulated. So in conclusion, I think it's simplistic to assume that mental impairment stems solely from misfiring neural circuitry in the brain, or, as Elon Musk is stating at the moment, that brain-computer interfaces will solve a lot of brain-related diseases. The psychiatrists Alan Francis and Thomas Weidegger have argued that neuroscience can aid in providing information about how the normal brain works, but understanding how things can go wrong in brain function remains elusive. And I wanted to leave you with this quotation from Dr. Thomas Insel, who was the head of the National Institute for Mental Health in the United States for many years. And he talks about how they put almost $20 billion into trying to find the cure for mental illness, as they termed it. But he says, I don't think we move the needs in reducing suicide, reducing hospitalisations, improving recovery for the tens of millions of people who have mental illness. So in conclusion, no matter what further technological developments occur, I think the main message is that neurointerventions alone won't solve the world's problems, but we should be spending time talking about the ethical and legal issues associated with them. Thanks.
Thanks so much for walking us through those really interesting development of arguments there, Bernadette. And there was a lot of different hot spots, you know, from my point of view flagged. And, you know, I have that opportunity, I guess, as chair to snaffle the opportunity to ask a question. But there are people in our group today that have posed questions, so I'll defer to them. We have some minutes for a bit of panel discussion backwards and forwards. I think we had a few general or kind of theory level questions that were put first, and one of them I found quite interesting to kick off maybe is, would we be better off to have more science or more law in this space? You know, as someone who's speaking from the ethics law perspective, Bernadette, do you have thoughts about that? You know, that it's a busy space and you know, where the balance needs to sit around that development of ideas and innovation?
I think we have both. I have to say that as a director of an interdisciplinary research centre, that we need to be talking across disciplines. We need to be talking much more to each other. And I think that is happening. It's happening all the time, but it may be that at a university level, it's easier to talk across disciplines and, you know, come up with the gold standard of interdisciplinary solutions to complex problems. It may be much more difficult in the private sector, where there's, you know, a focus on one single issue or one single invention or technology that is, you know, claimed to cure everything. But I think this is a wonderful opportunity to definitely talk across disciplines. We shouldn't just be saying it's just about science, it's just about law. It should all complement each other.
Yeah. Well, at a sort of pointy end of that discussion, Julia flagged a question about, you know, how confident can we feel about treatments if they're developed by private companies? How do we ensure that, you know, there is an interest in what's desirable and consented to by people and in their interests, rather than really about financial and reputation gain? And that's
a really difficult one. Yes, I think that's subject for a PhD thesis maybe. But again, I think a lot of it is just drawing attention to these issues and not assuming that you can do things just because you have money to do things. You know, to really question, well, what is going to be the end result? And I think, you know, there has to be some regulation there. Obviously, you know, consumer law can be used, but I think it's really just important to air, you know, what sort of solution are we actually really looking for here?
Yeah. I hope it's okay if this is developing as a bit of a conversation, because the questions that people have posed, I think I'm interested to take them on board, but maybe take them somewhere. One of the things that strikes me about that is your stance today. One of the questions that was put was, are we saying that ethical use of neuroscience leads to social good? You know, that it will take us to a better place. So, you know, some assumptions there about the intrinsic potential benefits and so forth, whereas there is also that possibility of people who are deeply concerned about the harm's potential and might, you know, be speaking much more from the ethics of preventing harm rather than thinking about potential for doing good and harm, you know. So I don't know if you want to comment on that.
It's always a balancing act, isn't it? Because, you know, anything has risks and benefits. And I think from the ethical perspective, you've got to weigh up both. And certainly, you know, the Stentrode device that is associated with people, you know, gaining some movement and communication devices and so on, you know, that is incredibly beneficial. But ultimately, I think it comes back to the individual. Does the individual, you know, consent to this? Does that person want this? And if they do have some form of technology which, you know, dramatically changes their life, as you've written about, Bridget, then, you know, what does that mean for their sense of identity, and who is there supporting them through this enormous change of life and identity? And, you know, they're huge questions. So I'm certainly not saying, you know, everything must be banned. I find it really interesting that neurosurgery, for example, is banned in some states. I think it's these sorts of experiments are going to continue, even if we, you know, may not want them to. I think they will. And so I think you have to be, from a pragmatic viewpoint, think about, okay, if they're to continue, if we can't just, you know, pull the plug on Neuralink, how do we frame the debate, the ethical and the legal issues, to ensure that these forms of technology are really accepted by the individual person rather than imposed on people? I think that's the important part for me. The informed consent part, I think, is very, very important.
Yes, I'm hearing you sort of drawing on a number of different ethical argumentative frames, you know, about potential goods and you know, a pragmatism and so forth. But there's that real bulwark in your argument around autonomy. So how much autonomy as a principle is a, you know, a stand that, you know, helps to, you know, cause us to conclude whether something's good or not good, is the opportunity for expression of autonomy. And then you were talking, and somebody's question relates to that nature of, you know, good, free, informed consent, how central that is, but also that question, that tricky question of insight or perceptions of insight, and, you know, that thorny chestnut of whether a lack of insight is grounds to override consent. And yeah, I suppose that's one of those very pointy areas of great contention, isn't it, in this space, in psychiatry in general and in surgery as well.
It is, and a lot of ink has been spilled about this through the centuries. Do we have substituted decision making? Can we move much more to supported decision making? And I think, you know, they are very strong philosophical debates that are ongoing, and there's no easy solution to them. But I think if you look certainly at interpretations of the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, the focus is on supports for decision making and shifting away from just this blanket presumption that people can't consent, working towards ensuring that the person can be supported as much as possible to consent, and particularly because many of these neurointerventions are experimental. I think that's the important thing, that they're still being tested as to the benefits. And therefore, I think there's probably stronger argumentation to say that it has to be fully informed consent here than if there was, reams and reams of studies that really implied that these neurointerventions are working to modify behaviour or whatever associated with mental impairments.
But there'd still have to be a discussion about whether that is the benefit a person wants, isn't it? So the idea of supported decision making still really is quite central. That supportive autonomy for decision making, even in the presence of evidence, is a really important principle, don't you think?
Absolutely, and particularly given the history where there was experimentation on people without consent, and deaths resulted. So we have to be serious in terms of the adverse consequences here, and the more adverse the consequences, the more we have to ensure that the past is not repeated.
And not just the adversity of the consequences, but also the experience of having autonomy overridden. That's such a powerful thing in this whole area of psychiatry and neuroscience, isn't it? And so that's part of people's experience as well, the intrinsic harm of having autonomy overridden. There was a question here about, is there a consumer movement involvement in this setting around the guidelines, just as there is in mental health? Is there? And I certainly know, and I'm sure you do too, Bernadette, that there's quite a lot of activism in the space of resisting, neuroscientific interventions amongst it's a subset of a mental health consumer, activist community. Is that your experience or your knowledge as well?
I believe that there's certain advocacy, but I think in relation to some of these, newer techniques, because they're so new, that maybe we haven't actually got to that stage. And I think that's part of why I'm really drawn to this topic and writing about it, because we haven't really explored this. There's this allure of neuroscience that we will find the answers, and we will be able to modify neural circuitry and so on for the good, and we may be able to, but it's still untried, and we are still learning so much about the brain. And I think that, maybe this is the oh brave new world, that this is what we need to look at.
With an abundance of caution and a significant amount of advocacy for that voice. Is that
exactly? Yeah, definitely. And I can't speak for people, and people may want this or may not, and that's why the more voices that are raised about this, I think the better.
Well, we've come right to time, Bernadette, on that point. I don't know confidently that everybody who flagged an issue feels their issue was covered, so I apologise if that's the case and I've slightly let you down in your in my role as chair. But I do want to thank you, Bernadette, for giving this really considered, interesting introduction to a topic that obviously does need a lot of attention. Thank you everyone who has participated and those brave people who put questions forward. The next event in this series is going to be at 1 o'clock on Thursday, the 1st of April, and Indigo Dyer is going to be speaking. Indigo is a very strong and also very entertaining, very animated and interesting spokesperson around the issue of consumer rights and human rights and that lived perspective. So I encourage you to continue, to join us with that next conversation. And I think with that, we'll conclude today's seminar. Thank you again, Bernadette.
Thank you.